Thank you, Sue, and good afternoon to all of you. It's a true honor to be here today celebrating the 75th anniversary. It does give me pause that we're hitting 75. I actually was one of the co-chairs of the 50th anniversary celebration 25 years ago, and I don't know where those 25 years went. And this marks my 45th year of being at the School of Public Health, so it's a wonderful experience to be here today. So my job is to kind of provide a quick overview of what we're talking about today and where we're going. Let me just say that my life is a calculus equation. I can tell you that probably more has happened in infectious diseases in the last 10 years than happened in the first 35 years of my career. And it's getting faster and faster and faster. And today I'll try to reflect that, because that's the world that we respond to. That's the world that we live in and have to deal with. This slide is one of about 80,000 slides I have in my electronic slide file. And I've said over and over again, even though it's an older slide, if I had one slide to protect in a slide file fire, this is the one I'd rescue. It basically was come from the 2000 time period, but it gives you a sense of the dynamics of the world today. In 1850, we had roughly 350,000 people in the face of the earth, 350 million people in the face of the earth. And today we're at 7.8 billion people. That's a remarkable concept to think of how the world has changed. In terms of days to circumnavigate the globe, with the fast sailing vessels, we sped that up a bit in the 1850s, but by 1950 with the jet engine, we changed that completely. Now that line looks pretty flat from 1950 on. I will suggest to you right now that that's the most incredibly dynamic part of the entire graph. And I'll share with you today why that's important with infectious diseases. I might also add in this graph, this is public health at its finest. Just remember that in 1900, average life expectancy in this country was 45 years. Grant you, men not quite as long as women. Today, the average life expectancy is 78 years. A little again, men not doing quite as well as women. For every 3.5 days we've lived in the last century, we've gained 1 day of life expectancy. Think about that. It took us from 80,000 generations in the caves to get to 45 years. Think where we've come. That's all public health, basically public health. How is the world changing? Well, this is an example, and we're going to hear about this when we talk about Ebola. But today, the fastest growing region of the world is not Asia. It's not in many places. It's actually Central Africa. Kinshasa today, 13.8 million people. In 4 other cities in the DRC, over 1 million. I was in Kinshasa in 1985 working on HIV. I can tell you at that time when the population was 2.8 million people, look at the difference just since 1985. 6.5 billion people, 1 million people live in Kinshasa in some of the worst squalor you could imagine in terms of the kind of living conditions, and I'll show you that in a minute. A big challenge. The other cities you can see, whether they're Lagos, Nairobi, down the line, all of these. In fact, Monrovia, Freetown, and Conakry, the 3 capital cities of West Africa where the Ebola epidemic took off in 2014-15, really, if you look at the 4.2 million combined population, was just a gas can waiting for an Ebola match to hit it. Kinshasa is a gas tanker waiting for an Ebola match to hit it. This is Kinshasa as we know it today. If you've ever been there, you will never forget it. It's incredible conditions for which lack of sewage, lack of city planning, etc., is a cauldron for the development and the spread of infectious diseases. And if we want to worry about can bugs move, I've always said a germ anywhere in the world today could be everywhere tomorrow. Think about this. In 2018, 4.1 billion international domestic air passengers flew somewhere between point A and point B. Now, some of us flew more than once. That was 39.4 million flights, an average of about 108,000 flights per day, or at any one time, about 4,800 planes are in the air going from somewhere to somewhere. Think how that mixes up all the potential infectious agents that we could imagine. Very different than that fast sailing vessel I showed you where it was at a little moment ago. In terms of the US, 632 million individuals, representing about 18.6% of all passengers worldwide, and China was next at 550 million. The bottom line is we are a big mixing vessel today, unlike at any time in history. That adds complexity to infectious diseases. This slide, which I took this morning, every hour in the hour, all 63,000 fast sailing vessels in the world, our basic warehouses for all the goods that we use every day, report their location and weather conditions. We track this. You can tell where hurricanes are coming, typhoons, etc. These fast sailing vessels, like this one right here, are now the new modern warehouse of manufacturing from around the world. Just to give you some sense of the size of these, this particular ship right here can hold 1 million washing machines on its trip from Seoul to Long Beach, California. Gives you a sense of the dynamics. Well, this is also a challenge for us today from an infectious disease perspective in particular, because you're going to see in a minute, we need a lot of things from around the world to deal with our jobs every day. This is an area that I think is by far one of the biggest crises we're yet to face, but we will face it, I worry, sooner than later. We're now involved with a study supported by the Walton Family Foundation. This has been something near and dear to my heart, and I wrote about in my book several years ago that I published, is the absence of critical acute care drugs when we need them. It turns out that we brought together a group and defined what is the high likelihood that people will die within 8 hours without this drug or cannot provide humane care without this drug or an alternative. We identified 153 drugs across 28 drug categories. It turns out that well over 94% originate from China. Either the APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, is made in China and sent to India, or it's actually made in China. Today, China has us literally hostage. If we could not go to war today with China, we would lose immediately, because today there are many thousands and thousands of people dependent on these drugs every day. 690,000 Americans in end-stage renal disease or advanced renal disease, all their medications, much of their dialysis coming from China. And yet these are drugs, by the way, we're putting tariffs on. So when one looks at this, you realize anything that would interrupt trade or travel, like a pandemic, could have collateral damage far beyond anything we could imagine. Our own modeling would suggest more people will die in the first 6 months of a severe influenza pandemic from the lack of these drugs than will die from influenza itself. If you look at the shortage situation that's occurring because of the manufacturing challenges just with making these drugs available regularly, not during a crisis, you can see here as you look that today, these are of the 153 drugs. Look at these numbers here and you can get a sense. As of right now, 63 of those 153 drugs are in shortage status in this country. We are constantly opting out to find some way to get an alternative or a different drug. This is just every day. Also, we're going to be facing water shortages that are going to be remarkable. We have been mining groundwater around the world for decades and decades. I can tell you, I was in a location in Hyderabad, India, 40 years ago, almost 40 years ago, in which they were drilling and finding water 12 to 15 feet below the surface. Today, the wells are abandoned at 700 feet because they become too salty. They've run out of water. Well, you can see from this map all the serious water shortages around the world. Yet this is the eternal solvent for public health. How do we run our sewer systems? How do we grow food? How do we have safe and clean water when you don't have water? And climate change is only going to continue to influence that because the runoff is going to often be massive events due to high volume, short-term rainfall that we're seeing already. So this is going to be a challenge for public health. And then this one probably is the one that really is the most concerning in many ways. This is a map showing the fragile state status of 178 countries in the world. And anything here from warning on, which you see there with the yellow, is actually a country that is literally on the potential edge of destabilization or not able to govern its population. When you look at that map, just know that 95 of the 95 of the 178 countries up here right now are in warning or more severe. That's 80% of the world's population live in a government country where basically it's relatively unstable. Try to do public health in those kinds of conditions. 2 years ago, I published a book, and I'm not here to try to sell it, only to say it's the framework for which I look at this. Deadliest Enemy, Our War Against Killer Germs. And frankly, it was a love letter from my perspective to my kids and grandkids. What do I have left to give them? What can we do with this world that we live in now for the future? And in that, I came up with 9 priority areas. The first 2 really are the only 2 that I consider of pandemic potential, an epidemic of worldwide proportions. Influenza will come back over and over again. And antimicrobial resistance, why it's not one bug kind of situation, it is truly a pandemic in terms of all the collective resistance we're seeing. And then we get into the diseases of critical regional importance that can have major impact in a region like Ebola, like Zika. Mosquitoes are Clearly important, bioterrorism, all of these areas are ones we have to address. But let me today concentrate really on those top ones to give you a sense of the challenges we have, and I know that Sonja and Jim will be following up in similar fashion with these diseases. This is an op-ed piece I wrote in the New York Times several years ago saying, the real threat to national security is deadly disease. Let me just say, if we had a severe pandemic today and we basically couldn't bring those drugs from China here because manufacturing was shut down, transportation was shut down, this would make a war seem kind of not so bad. That's a pretty hard thought to think about. So in fact, we have to begin looking at national security and these infectious diseases. Ask the developing world countries, the low-income countries of the world that have had Ebola outbreaks, that have had severe cholera outbreaks, what this means to them. This is a report that was done by the World Health the United Nations right after the 2013-15 Ebola outbreak in West Africa, in which they basically concluded, my God, public health is really in dire straits globally. We are not well prepared to deal with many of the crises we have today. And the panel chair actually wrote the following. Following the extensive consultation, the panel notes that the high risk of major health crises is widely underestimated. The world's preparedness and capacity to respond is woefully insufficient. Future epidemics could far exceed the scale and devastation of the West Africa Ebola outbreak. The panel was very concerned to learn that the emergence of a highly pathogenic influenza virus, which could rapidly result in millions of deaths and cause major social, economic, and political disruption, is not an unlikely scenario. Well, it's not just flu. Flu is clearly the leader. I don't think we quite get the fact that as many steps as we've taken forward in public health and infectious diseases, the last 20 to 30 years, we've taken many, many steps backwards. Ebola is an example. You're going to hear more about that from our speakers coming, but again, it's a wildlife disease in parts of Africa, for which when that spills over into humans, of course, we see this type of hemorrhagic disease. This was the 2013-15 epidemic in the 3 Western African countries that redefined Ebola. When you think about it, what happened? Well, if you can read in the 3rd paragraph up there, it says, what happened? Did the virus change? No, it didn't. Africa changed. And the urbanization of Africa, as we see the urbanization much of the world, has fundamentally changed how infectious diseases happen. What happens? In this paper that we published, our group, with a number of international experts at the same time of the 2013-14 outbreak, we reviewed all the previous 24 Ebola epidemics that had occurred between 1976 and 2013. Only 2,400 cases in all those 24 outbreaks. And they were easily contained. Today, why is it that we're still fighting a second Ebola outbreak that is challenging us immensely after West Africa? Again, Africa's changed, so has the world. This is the epidemiologic curve for the current epidemic that's in the DRC, one that has had 3,313 deaths as of this morning, 2,215 cases, 2,215 deaths, and it looks good in the sense, oh my gosh, it looks like it's ending. And we were hopeful that we were bringing it to an end after all the social unrest that occurred and made it difficult to contain. But look at what's happened here. If you follow this, you can actually see, as we report out by date from CIDRAP News, this one in November, Ebola cases hit 3,285 as transmission rate slows. People were getting optimistic. We were down to 2, 1 case a day. But then all of a sudden, the violence erupted again. You can see here in November or December what happened, where new violence suspends Ebola response in a key hotspot area. Again, we had more security. We're so close, but we're beginning to lose it because we're shutting down our operations. More violence continues to stall Ebola response in DRC hotspots as of just very recently here. And then even more so, we actually had to pull complete staff out because they were being targeted. The last 2 weeks, 6 Ebola workers were targeted and killed trying to do their work. And here it is right here in the 2 attacks. And so the challenge is right now, we don't know what's happening. Today there were 5 new cases reported. The problem is we don't have good reporting right now because everything's been shutting down. We were that close. I don't know which way this is going to go in the next 2 weeks. With the violence as it is, we could see a reoccurrence of the major Ebola epidemic, maybe not. This isn't about vaccines, guys. This isn't about public health response. This is about security and what it is to do public health in a world like this. I reported earlier this week, again, more snags for the Ebola situation. So this is the world we live in. Now flu. Influenza is the one that I mentioned earlier, clearly is a major challenge for us. And influenza is at a point in human and animal history unlike any time ever has been. We all know that the primary reservoir for influenza viruses that then make their way to humans is avian species, primarily poultry today. And we know that when those viruses eventually change and get into a pig population where they change a little bit more, or they get into humans, that's when the likelihood for a new pandemic strain, or a strain that humans can be infected by and spread, but in fact, we don't have protection. Well, just look at these numbers here. This is remarkable. Today, we live in a chicken world. There are more chickens than any other mammal or avian species on the planet. Why? Because we need protein. Today, the conversion of energy is most effectively done in a chicken. 25 to 35 days out, that chicken's harvested, and that chicken breast is on your plate. So today, you can see up there, we're talking about 22 billion chickens in the earth. The next highest bird species has only 1.5 billion. To feed Shanghai, to feed the world, we now have this. And if you want to breed avian influenza viruses, just do this. Just watch what happens. It's remarkable. So we're sitting on the cusp of what could be one of the most dynamic periods of avian virus maturation and transmission to humans imaginable. And we can't forget what happened in 1918. I know this is of some debate with some. It's not among many of us. Let me remind you that in 1918, just like we saw in 2009, but fortunately at a much lower level, what killed people was what killed them young. And what killed them young was not bacterial infections, it was a cytokine storm. It was a condition that, frankly, we don't do a hell of a lot better today in 2020 than we did in 1918. And so if we have another one of those events, and I might add, just to give you a sense, the average age of deaths in 2009 with H1N1 was actually younger when adjusted for life expectancy than 1918. Think about that. A H1N1 strain, what it does. So we are primed potentially for more large and very, very disruptive and potentially very consequential pandemics. We have reviewed the 1918 pandemic and we warn that it's a global threat. You got to take this seriously, and yet most of the world has had very little preparation for this. We published a paper in 2011 that almost I thought was going to get me burned at the stake. My name was thrown out there at the time with the dear gentleman who gave us measles and autism, in which we challenged how well flu vaccines worked. And it had not to do anybody intentionally misrepresented them. They didn't understand how to measure outcome for flu. They were using serology, which turned out it didn't work well. And we found that, you know what, that 70, 90% is not true. If you get 50%, that's a good year. In many years, you'll get 0. Just like last year with H3N2, H1N1, one of them gave us 48% protection, the other one gave us 0. Now, it's still the best we have. I've been vaccinated, I get my vaccine, but don't count on it being the answer. And more importantly, don't count on the world having access to it. In every one of the pandemics to date, it's always arrived after the second big wave. I don't see how that's going to change much in the future. So until we change that, that's going to be a big, huge problem. The good news is there's now finally a lot of work going on trying to move this forward. This is a piece in today's New England Journal of Medicine, Preparing for the Next Pandemic, the WHO's Global Influenza Strategy. I'd like to say to my colleagues at WHO, thank you for this, but it's not very meaningful. Industry is really where the action's at, and industry can only produce probably 400,000 or 400 million doses of vaccine for the 7.7 billion people in the first 6 to 12 months, where the pandemic will already hit and been gone. So we need to work on this area. It's a huge area of importance. One area I also just want to mention briefly is antimicrobial resistance. This paper is, to me, one of the most fascinating pieces in all of science. This is a study that a group did in the far, far reaches of Carlsbad Caverns, where they went in back where no human had been in 3 million years, and they cultured the walls aseptically to see what they could find for microbes, and they found a lot of them. And they found that they were resistant up to 14 of the current commercially available antibiotics. You say, well, how can that be? They had no access to them. Well, microbes have been fighting for space and food since the beginning of time. And each time, a mutation, which frequently occurs in their reproductive stages, means that something bad happens to them and they die, or something good happens and they beat out the guy next to them because now my cell wall isn't affected by that chemical you put out, and in fact the chemical I put out now is going to kill you. That's antimicrobial resistance. And it turns out that we, before we ever made the first antibiotic, already had a challenge. Antibiotic resistance is a global evolution at its finest. So please don't think that we can outsmart the bugs this way. We're living in an era where we're just borrowing time with the antibiotics that we have developed and used. This is a report that was published by the AMR group in England 2.5 years ago. Sir Jim O'Neill led this effort commissioned by the British government and supported by the Wellcome Trust, and it was by far the most comprehensive review of antimicrobial resistance anywhere it's ever been done. And in this particular report, they laid out very clearly all the different organisms that we need to be concerned about, and some of them they didn't even have on there at the time, but today, for example, there's a fungus today that we worry greatly about that's resistant. But what was also telling is, to give some perspective to this, they predicted that by 2050, there'd be more deaths from antimicrobial resistance, as you can see, than cancer and diabetes combined worldwide, adjusted for age. Think about that. We've been all talking about chronic diseases, which are really important, but we are losing the power of antibiotics that gave us those 45 to 78-year life expectancy changes, in part. This report was reviewed 2 months ago at a meeting at Chatham House in London, and to say everyone was disappointed by the world's response was an understatement. And look at the last sentence up there. The antimicrobial resistance by 2050 could result in 10 million people dying with an economic impact of $100 trillion. And you know what? It's like climate change today, which, while there are activists and there are groups, we're losing the battle on climate change. You know, we've got greenhouse gas levels now we haven't seen in 3 million years. And we aren't taking this seriously. Well, what does that mean? I don't know if I'll go here yet to say that the post-antibiotic era is here, but we're getting closer and closer every day. The easy antibiotics are gone. Today, commercially, nobody wants to make an antibiotic if you're a pharmaceutical company, because we tell you don't use it unless you absolutely need to, which does not a lot of things for your sales. It's like trying to, sell a car that is the best running, best looking, safest, most fuel efficient car, but you can only drive it on Sunday from 9 to 9:30 a.m. Nobody buys it. So today, we can't get the industry interested in these antibiotics. This is one huge one we have to deal with. Let me just say a couple of comments about mosquitoes, the absolutely most dangerous creature on Earth in terms of human and animal health. This is probably the saddest commentary on the fluid nature of public health preparedness. If I were to ask you this question, I'm sure most of you might not think this is the answer, but the very first country in the world to eliminate malaria from its populous regions was Venezuela. They beat the United States in 1964. They beat the United States. Today, Venezuela is in such free fall. Doctors, nurses, architects don't have work, so what do? They end up going out into the illegal gold mines in the jungles, where they do pick up malaria. They bring it back to the major metropolitan areas. Today, we have the largest outbreaks of urbanized malaria in the history of the world in Venezuela. How can we go from eliminating it to now the worst in the world? That shows you the importance of maintaining public health preparedness. This is by far the most dangerous of mosquitoes, you might say, in terms of the number of the newer diseases we talk about. When I came into the business in 1975 at the university here, I was told by many, why the hell are you going into infectious diseases? It's the coarse and buggy stuff. Well, if you look at that map, you can see where Aedes aegypti was located in the 1930s and what PAHO and the Rockefeller Foundation had done by 1970. This is a mosquito that won't fly across a city street or an open field. It's a mosquito that's a daytime biter, bites you in the back of the neck, back of the elbows, back of the knees. You don't feel it, and it loves to live in dark, cloistered areas and little bodies of water, like what might be in a water vessel or a piece of plastic that holds a little bit of water. That's it. Look what happened. By 2015, look at where Aedes aegypti is today. And not only is it there, but it's in population levels anywhere from 100 to 500 times what it was even in the 1930s. Is this public health progress? Well, when we talk about diseases like yellow fever and dengue and Zika, chikungunya, now you start to think about what does this all mean? And it's these kinds of environments today. For a couple of you in the room old enough to remember The Graduate, what did we tell Benjamin to go into? Plastics. Well, it's not the water the pigs are in, it's all that tire and plastics back there. It's the plastics on one of the most popular beaches for the Olympics several years ago. It's the plastics that are in every urbanized area and many rural areas. And that's where we have to think about what we're looking for the future. Let me just close off with clearly the issue of where we're going today with the whole area of vaccine hesitancy. There can be no greater, again, immediate failure that we can imagine than what's happened with measles. I grew up in a world of measles before the first measles vaccine, and we had kids my age die. But many of you in this room have not ever had to worry about that. Well, today, because of vaccine hesitancy, one of the top 10 priorities that WHO has launched for this year, we are now seeing major challenges with measles. This is the worldwide measles epidemic that, by the way, it's in the down phase right on that far right side, but no, that's when it's seasonally adjusted. And when you look, we're already at over 440,000 cases of measles for this year, and by the time world reporting catches up, and we know many don't get reported, it'll be much higher. Later today, the WHO, tomorrow, Friday, their time, are going to be announcing that they have now concluded that last year alone, over 140,000 individuals in the world died from measles. Died from measles. Something no one should die from. And yet, look how far we've slipped back. More importantly, don't forget, and I tried to detail this in my book, what kills us versus what hurts us versus what concerns us, what scares the hell out of us is all very different many times. 2,200 people have died from Ebola over the course of this Ebola outbreak in DRC. 4,400, or now 4,500 kids have died from measles in the same area at the same time. Did you ever be anybody dying from measles there? We all talked about Ebola, but the infrastructure doesn't exist, and so these kids were dying of measles. 6 nations now report polio cases this past week. 18 different countries have reported polio this past year. We thought we were going to eliminate it, eradicate it out of everywhere. Today, it's at the highest level it's been in years. Again, why? Well, 110 Pakistani polio eradicators have all been assassinated in the last 2 years trying to deliver polio vaccine in Pakistan. Think about that. It's a whole new world order. Let me just conclude by saying, as Sir Winston Churchill once said, it's no use saying we're doing our best. You've got to succeed in doing what is necessary. If any of you want to get in the fight against infectious disease and public health, now is the time. If there's ever been a need for a renaissance, if there's ever been a need to reestablish our ability to respond to infectious diseases, it's now. It's going to be very different than I first knew when I got into the business. A lot of additional challenges. But I'm telling you, as I've shared with you throughout, we will deal with infectious diseases for the decades to come. And how public health responds to that will determine a lot about how that love letter to my kids and grandkids plays out. Thank you.